Hey there, it's Marcus here, and just been thinking about 2026 and what, as practitioners, coaches, wellness professionals, we need to step into for this year. There's an evolutionary process that's happening on the planet. That process is, moving us into another sort of potential dimension of reality. Lots of talk about where that's heading, moving from sort of 3D into 5D or whatever that might be. Regardless of that truth, what I certainly realize is that we are on an evolutionary journey, and for a long time we've been stagnant in that journey. But I'm thinking that 2026 is going to really start to move the needle. We're seeing a lot of things sort of happening on the planet, geopolitically and energetically, that are sort of pointing in this direction. And I think the important thing for us as wellness professionals or coaches, practitioners, whatever it might be, or even as individuals, is that we continually move in that dimensional journey. And I think the healing space right now is asking for us to step up to a whole other level of reality. Let me share what I mean with you. So I think right now there's a couple of sort of core areas that sort of practitioners work with. And if we think of this as a client coming into, a session with us, and if we just think for a moment of client sessional work, what I think happens and where most practitioners sit is in this sort of first space, which I'm calling the presenting problem. And this is where clients come in and they tell us, here's my problem. Here's what I'm suffering from. I've got fatigue, or I've got headaches, I've got pains, I've got this particular illness. And I think it's really easy to sort of get caught in this space, in this, what I call the presenting problem sphere. And I think where most practitioners work, let's call it, 70% of practitioners tend to work in this space where a client comes in, tells them the problem, here's my presenting problem, great, let's deal with that, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with dealing with that presenting problem. I think the issue comes as we are continuing this evolutionary process and we're seeing clients coming in with more and more overlapping, intertwined presenting problems, because that then leads you to this sort of second space where it's not just one presenting problem. If it was one or two presenting problems, then not an issue. But when it comes to multiple problems, you get sort of pushed into this next phase, which is into what I call the reality haze. Reality haze. And the reality haze is where it's really sort of super easy to then start to get a bit lost and confused, right? It's really easy to fall into that trap of, lost, confused. I don't really know what to do. I'm going to try, obviously, to, deal with stuff. And I think 20% of practitioners sort of find themselves in this space. And it's a tricky place because you're now dealing with, 3 to 6 sort of problems that people are facing. They're all intertwined and they look different, but they're the same. And it sort of all sort of gets sort of messy. I think the next phase that we then need to step into is into this sort of phase of the deeper level of truth, deeper truth of what's really going on here, and starting to sort of really play in this space of maybe, what's really going on. This is where we start to step into the more sort of dimensional realms. Here's quite sort of 3D. Maybe this is 4D. Maybe this is starting to get into 5D, where we're sort of starting to step into a more dimensional space, where we're starting to really look at things outside the square, outside the box, and starting to look at a bit more of that sort of core truth. And let's say arbitrarily 9% of practitioners sort of sit in that space. But I think as we move into 2026, there's another sort of space that's really opening up, and this is to get deeply into the core dimensional nature of reality. and start to work with the dimensional aspects of these sort of issues and problems that people are finding. And I think right now, really 1% of practitioners are probably sitting in that space. And I think, when you go through this in this very first space, it's quite practical. You're looking at all the practical things that sort of can play out, and you're resting on a lot of your training and that real practical. Maybe you're resting on testing and some of the more scientific processes that sort of play out. In this next phase, you're then moving into sort of a more research phase where you're now trying to go, okay, let's research what might be really going on and trying to filter through all of that sort of haze. I think the deeper truth, you're starting to move into a more intuitive space. And if you work with your intuition, then that's probably where you're sitting, where you're maybe dealing with the practical and the research stuff, but then you're falling back into intuition and going, okay, let's just feel into what's really going on, because the rest of it's a bit messy. And I think the next phase that we're stepping into, this dimensional phase, is really into the insight phase, where you're actually working more in line with the dimensional nature of reality, working more in line with the universal consciousness, and you're allowing yourself to receive that information. A lot of the shamans sort of worked in this sort of space between the deeper truth and the sort of core dimensional aspects of the healing space. And I think right now, from an evolutionary point of view, this is where we are needing to sit. 2026 really needs us to be in this space, to allow us to be the best, most effective practitioner possible, to really sort of embrace that space. And for some, that's going to be tricky and difficult, right? Because you're going to step outside of a framework. In these sort of phases here, there's this really beautiful sort of framework that sits, and you can box things up really nicely and tightly. And in the past, that's worked incredibly well, and there are still spaces for that, without a doubt. But I think that's starting to lose its traction because of this reality haze, which makes things more complex and difficult. And it's really easy in this phase to move into sort of confusion and to get lost in that reality haze, right? Here, we're now being presented with multiple issues and problems, right? Which means we have to move into this phase. But if we're not careful, that's just going to lead to, to confusion. Here we start to move into, clarity. And here we're moving into crystal clarity. Crystal clarity. Yep. Not from a mental point of view, but from a full body perspective. We're moving into that crystal clarity phase, and out of the multiple confusing aspects. So I think that's where we're heading this year, is to really embrace that. And as a practitioner who wants to be the best, most effective practitioner possible, then if you're not already starting to play with this area, this is absolutely the space that that you need to start to play in this space here. You may already be using your intuition. You may already be in the 9%, but I think right now we need more people in the 1%, which is to really look at these core dimensional aspects of what's truly going on in someone's life, and then applying dimensional sort of techniques, tools, systems, processes, it's beyond that, to actually help them to come out the other side of that and to continue their evolutionary journey. And this is all happening on purpose. It's all happening for a particular reason. And I think it's time for us, if you're called, to really step into that and really embrace that process. All right, here's to an amazing year, and all of us stepping up into the next part of our own evolutionary journey, whatever that might be for you. And have fun thinking about this. Where are you in this process? Love to know. All right, ciao.